The Alpha King believed his son was possessed by demons. The pack physicians whispered that Prince Michael Newhill was cursed by ancient wolf magic itself. For 3 years the 8-year-old heir screamed in torment every time he moved, turning violent and hateful until he was hidden away in the palace chambers like a royal shame. Then came Nina Henderson, a desperate Omega maid with nothing left to lose. She didn't listen to the warnings. She listened to the boy's anguished cries. And when she defied every order to help the suffering child, her fingers found something hard, buried deep beneath the skin at the base of his skull. It wasn't bone. It wasn't tissue. It was the tip of a blackened silver barb driven straight into his spine, coated in poison. What she pulled out that night wouldn't just save a child. It would expose a conspiracy that could destroy the entire Ironstone pack. The stone walls of the Ironstone Palace rose like prison bars against the evening sky, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow anyone who dared approach. For Nina Henderson, an Omega with worn-out shoes and an empty coin purse, fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed this job. The autumn wind cut through the courtyard, carrying the scent of distant rain and something darker. Old magic, old pain. Nina pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way to the servants' entrance. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. Alpha King Abel Newhill was a legend on the battlefield, a ruthless warrior who had united 3 warring packs through sheer force of will. But it was his home life that people whispered about in hushed tones. His mate had died 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances. His son, the heir to the throne, was said to be broken, violent, cursed, impossible to manage. Nina was met at the heavy oak door by Mrs. Grayson, the head housekeeper. The woman had eyes like shards of ice and a mouth that looked like it had never smiled once in 60 years. "You're the new one, Nina?" Mrs. Grayson asked, looking the young woman up and down with obvious skepticism. "Yes, ma'am," Nina said quietly, lowering her gaze as a proper Omega should. "I'm here for the nursery attendant position." Mrs. Grayson let out a harsh laugh. "Nursery attendant? Don't flatter yourself, girl. You're here to clean up the mess and keep the boy from destroying the room. 27 maids have quit or been dismissed in 3 years. The prince is difficult. If he lashes out, you do not strike back. If he screams, you do not run to us. If you fail in your duties, you're out on the streets with no references. Do you understand?" "I understand," Nina whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Good. And one more thing. Lady Margot Sinclair, the king's chief advisor, demands absolute order in the East Wing. If you disturb her or cause any disruption, she'll have you thrown out to the rogues beyond the border. Clear?" Nina nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She was led through winding corridors of cold stone and faded tapestries. The palace was magnificent. Vaulted ceilings, carved archways, stained glass windows depicting ancient wolf legends. But the air felt wrong. It was heavy, suffocating. It smelled of neglect, of secrets, of grief that had soaked into the very walls. When they reached the prince's door, Mrs. Grayson produced a heavy iron key from her belt. The lock turned with a sound like a death knell. "Change the bedding. Remove the soiled linens. Leave fresh water and food. Do not engage with the boy unless absolutely necessary. Do not touch him. Are we clear?" "Yes, ma'am." The door swung open and the smell hit Nina like a physical blow. It wasn't just the smell of an uncleaned room. It was the scent of infection, of unwashed wounds, of fear so old it had fermented into something toxic. The room was large but dark. Heavy curtains blocked out the fading daylight. In the far corner, huddled against the stone wall, was a small figure wrapped in torn blankets. Prince Michael Newhill. The Alpha heir. 8 years old. He looked nothing like a prince. His dark hair was matted and greasy. His clothes, once fine silk, were now stained rags. Even from across the room, Nina could see he was painfully thin, his cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin. As Nina took a cautious step forward, Michael's head snapped up. His eyes, golden like his father's but dull with suffering, locked onto hers. A low, animalistic growl rumbled from his throat. It wasn't the growl of an aggressive child. It was the sound of a wounded creature that had learned to fear every human touch. "Shoo," Nina soothed instinctively, softening her voice and her scent. "I'm not going to hurt you, Michael. I promise." The boy bared his teeth, scrambling backward. His shoulder hit the wall and he let out a sharp cry of pain, far too intense for a simple bump. Nina froze. Why would that hurt so much? She moved slowly, deliberately, keeping her distance as she set about her tasks. She stripped the soiled sheets from the bed, scrubbed the floors, replaced the cold, untouched food with fresh bread and meat. All the while she watched him. He didn't move like a normal child. His head was tilted at an odd angle, always to the left as if he couldn't straighten his neck. Every time he shifted position his whole body would tense and shudder. His hands trembled. His breathing was shallow and rapid. This wasn't behavioral. This was physical pain. By the time evening shadows began to creep across the floor, the room was clean, but the boy still sat huddled in his corner, untouched food beside him. Nina knew the rules. Do not touch the prince. But something in her chest, something primal and protective that she didn't fully understand, wouldn't let her leave him like this. She filled a basin with warm water and grabbed a clean cloth. Slowly, carefully, she approached the corner where he sat. I know you're hurting, she whispered, kneeling a few feet away. But you can't stay like this, sweetheart. The dirt will make the pain worse. Michael watched her with those haunted golden eyes. He growled again, but quieter now. Too exhausted to maintain his defenses. Nina moved inch by inch. When she finally reached out with the damp cloth, he flinched so violently he nearly toppled over. But she didn't pull back. She gently touched his hand. He froze. Every muscle in his small body went rigid. He was waiting for the blow, the slap, the cruelty he'd learned to expect. When none came, his eyes widened with confusion. That's it, Nina murmured. I've got you. You're safe now. She began to clean his face, wiping away layers of grime. He leaned into the warmth of the cloth despite himself. For the first time she saw him clearly, Abel's sharp features softened by youth. A beautiful child, buried under years of neglect. She moved the cloth down to his neck, then to his shoulders. As her fingers brushed against the base of his skull, hidden beneath his matted hair, she felt something that shouldn't be there. Something hard. Buried under the skin. Michael screamed. It was a sound of pure agony, piercing and desperate. His hand shot out and clamped down on Nina's wrist, his small fingers digging in with surprising strength. Ah! Nina gasped, but she didn't pull away. She didn't strike him. Instead her heart broke. Because in that moment she understood. This child wasn't cursed. He wasn't possessed. Someone had done this to him. Someone had hurt him deliberately, systematically for 3 years. And Nina Henderson, a lowly Omega maid with nothing to lose and everything to prove, was about to make sure that someone paid. If you're already hooked by Nina's story, prove you're part of the pack. Hit that like button, subscribe and howl your location in the comments below. Where are you watching from tonight? Let's see how far our pack reaches across the globe. Now back to the story. Nina jerked awake to the sound of screaming. Not the ordinary cry of a child having nightmares, but a raw, guttural shriek that seemed to claw its way up from somewhere deep and primal. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, her thin nightdress tangling around her legs as she stumbled toward the connecting door between her tiny servant's chamber and Michael's room. The screaming didn't stop. It rose and fell in waves, punctuated by sounds that made her stomach turn, the thud of small fists against stone, the desperate scrabbling of nails against wood. She fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the candle. When she finally threw open the door, the sight stole the breath from her lungs. Michael was convulsing on the floor beside his bed, his small body arching backward at an impossible angle. His eyes were rolled back, showing only whites. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth. His hands clawed at the back of his head with such violence that blood streaked through his matted hair, dark rivulets running down his neck. Michael! Nina dropped to her knees beside him, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. During a seizure, protect the head. Keep them from hurting themselves. Don't restrain too hard. She grabbed one of the pillows from the bed and tried to cushion his head, but the moment her hands touched him, his whole body went rigid. The scream that tore from his throat was so piercing she thought her eardrums might burst. I'm sorry, she whispered, pulling back slightly but not letting go. She couldn't let him crack his skull against the stone floor. She shifted her position, cradling his head in her lap, absorbing the violent jerks of his body. His small fingers dug into her arms hard enough to bruise, but she held steady, murmuring the same soothing words she'd once used with her grandmother during her final pain-racked days. "You're safe. I've got you. You're not alone." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Gradually, agonizingly, the convulsions began to subside. Michael's body went limp, his breathing ragged and wet. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time they seemed to focus on her face. They were lucid now, bright with unshed tears and something that looked terrifyingly like hope. His hand, still trembling, reached up and grabbed Nina's wrist. Not to push her away this time, but to pull her closer. With strength that shouldn't have belonged to an 8-year-old child, he guided her hand to the back of his head, pressing her fingers against a spot just below his skull where the hair was thickest and most matted with blood. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "Please make it stop." Nina's fingers explored the area carefully, and her blood turned to ice. There, beneath the skin and tissue, was something that absolutely should not exist. Something hard and angular. Too smooth to be bone, too geometric to be natural. Felt like metal. Like it had been deliberately placed there. Her eyes met Michael's, and in that shared moment of horror and understanding, she saw the truth written in his desperate, pleading gaze. This wasn't a curse. This wasn't divine punishment or bad bloodlines or any of the whispered explanations the palace staff had invented. This was torture. Someone had done this to him. Someone had embedded something in his skull and left him to suffer for 3 years while everyone around him called him broken, cursed, impossible. "Who did this to you?" Nina breathed, but Michael's eyes were already closing, exhaustion dragging him back toward unconsciousness. His hand slipped from her wrist, falling limply to his side. Nina sat frozen on the cold floor, cradling the child's head in her lap, her mind racing. She should call for the physician. She should alert Mrs. Grayson. She should wake the king himself. But something stopped her, an instinct she couldn't name. If someone had done this to the prince, if someone had hidden this torture in plain sight for 3 years, then whoever it was had power. Trust. And if Nina started asking questions now before she understood what she was dealing with, she might not live long enough to help this child at all. Nina waited until Michael's breathing evened out before she moved. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, but one thing crystallized with absolute clarity. She couldn't leave that thing in his head. Not for another hour. Not for another minute. Every second it remained embedded in his skull was another second of agony for this child. She carried him carefully back to the bed, laying him on his side so she could access the back of his head. Then she moved to the medical kit Mrs. Grayson had shown her earlier, a dusty leather case tucked in the corner, rarely used. Inside she found what she needed: tweezers, a small pair of scissors, clean bandages, and a bottle of strong alcohol meant for sterilizing wounds. Her hands shook as she lit more candles, arranging them around the bed until the room was bright enough to see clearly. She poured alcohol over the tweezers, watching the liquid drip onto a clean cloth. This was madness. She had no medical training beyond caring for her grandmother's bedsores. One wrong move and she could damage his spine, paralyze him, kill him. But leaving it in would kill him too. Just slower. Nina knelt beside the bed and gently parted Michael's blood-matted hair. In the candlelight she could see it clearly now. A small puncture wound, old and scarred over, but the skin around it was inflamed, angry red. Infected. How long had this been festering? "Michael," she whispered, touching his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "I'm going to try to take it out. It's going to hurt. Do you understand?" He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Nina grabbed a leather strap from the medical kit, meant for restraining patients during surgery, and folded it. "Bite down on this," she said, placing it between his teeth. He obeyed without question, his trust in her both humbling and terrifying. She positioned the tweezers at the edge of the puncture wound, said a silent prayer to gods she wasn't sure she believed in, and began to probe. Michael's entire body went rigid. A muffled scream escaped around the leather strap, but he didn't pull away. Nina's vision blurred with tears, but she couldn't stop now. She felt the tweezers connect with something solid, something that definitely wasn't bone. She adjusted her grip, trying to get purchase on the object without pushing it deeper. Minutes crawled by like hours. Sweat dripped down Nina's face, mixing with tears she didn't remember shedding. Michael's muffled screams became whimpers, then went silent. He'd passed out from the pain. Maybe that was a mercy. Finally, blessedly, she felt it shift. She held her breath and pulled, steady and slow. The resistance was horrible, like the thing had rooted itself into his flesh. Then all at once it came free. Nina stumbled backward, nearly dropping the tweezers. Dangling from their grip was a blackened silver barb, nearly 2 inches long, covered in dried blood and a tar-like substance that reeked of something chemical and wrong. This wasn't medical. This was a weapon. A torture device designed to cause maximum pain while leaving minimal external evidence. Michael's body went completely limp on the bed, his breathing deep, and even for the first time since she'd met him, the tension that had held his small frame rigid for 3 years simply disappeared. He looked younger in sleep, peaceful, like the child he should have been. Nina wrapped the barb carefully in a clean cloth, her hands still trembling. She would take this to the king at first light. She would show Alpha Abel what had been done to his son. Surely he would want to know the truth. Surely he would demand justice. But as she tucked the cloth-wrapped evidence into her apron pocket and looked down at Michael's sleeping face, a cold whisper of doubt crept into her mind. Someone had access to this child. Someone powerful enough to place this device and ensure no one questioned it for 3 years. And somewhere in this palace that someone was still walking free. Nina was still cleaning the blood from Michael's wound when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Her heart lurched. It was too early for the morning staff, still an hour before dawn. She'd meant to clean herself up, to hide the evidence of what she'd done until she could present it properly to the king. But there was no time. The door burst open without warning. Lady Margot Sinclair swept into the room like a storm given human form, her silk robe billowing behind her, her dark hair perfectly arranged despite the hour. Behind her, filling the doorway with his imposing frame, stood Alpha King Abel Newhill himself. His gray eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight with what looked like barely controlled rage. "Your Majesty." Margot's voice was pitched perfectly, shocked, horrified, but still composed. "I told you I heard screaming." "Look." Nina scrambled to her feet, the bloody tweezers still in one hand, the cloth-wrapped barb in the other. She realized too late how damning this must look. "Your Majesty, I can explain." "What have you done?" Abel's voice was low, dangerous, the growl of a wolf barely leashed. "I found something," Nina said quickly, holding out the cloth bundle. "Something that was hurting him. Someone put this in his." Margot moved with the fluid grace of a predator. She rushed forward, reaching for the bundle as if to examine it, but her hand struck Nina's wrist instead. The cloth tumbled from Nina's grasp, unraveling as it fell. The blackened barb clattered across the floor, rolling inexorably toward the fireplace where the morning fire had been lit to ward off the dawn chill. "No." Nina lunged for it, but Margot was faster. She kicked it, seemingly by accident, and the barb tumbled directly into the flames. "Oh." Margot gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Forgive me, I didn't mean, I was only trying to help." The evidence curled and blackened in the fire, the tar-like coating hissing and smoking. Within seconds, it was unrecognizable, just another piece of charred debris. Nina's blood turned to ice. That was no accident. The timing, the precision. Margot had destroyed the evidence deliberately. Which meant, "Your Majesty," Margot turned to Abel, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine distress. "I heard sounds of struggle from the prince's chambers. When I arrived, I found this Omega servant standing over him with those." She pointed at the bloody tweezers in Nina's hand. "Look at his neck. She's wounded him. And you can see the blood on her hands, her apron. I believe she was attempting to poison the prince. Perhaps inject him with something. Thank the gods I arrived when I did." "That's not true." Nina's voice cracked with desperation. "I was helping him. There was something in his skull, something metal. I pulled it out and he's sleeping peacefully now, can't you see? For the first time in 3 years he's not in pain." Abel's eyes moved to the bed where Michael lay motionless, his small chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. For a moment, something flickered across the king's face. Uncertainty, perhaps even hope. But then his gaze returned to Nina's bloody hands, the fresh wound on his son's neck, the tweezers that looked like an instrument of harm in the wrong context. "He's sleeping because she's drugged him," Margot said softly, placing a delicate hand on Abel's arm. "My lord, I know this is difficult, but we must act quickly. If she's part of a plot against the heir." "I'm not." Nina took a step toward Abel, her hands outstretched in supplication. "Please, your majesty, just examine him. You'll see he's better, he's—" "Guards." Abel's voice cracked like a whip. Two massive warriors appeared in the doorway as if they'd been waiting just outside. "Take her to the dungeon. She's to be executed at dawn for attempted murder of the crown prince." "No, please, you have to listen." Nina's words were cut off as rough hands grabbed her arms, yanking her toward the door. "Your majesty, wait." She struggled against the guard's grip, her eyes locked on Michael's sleeping form. "He can tell you. When he wakes, he'll tell you what happened." "My son hasn't spoken a coherent word in 3 years, Abel said, his voice hollow, defeated. "Whatever you've done to him, whatever game you're playing, it ends now." Nina was dragged backward through the door, her feet scrambling for purchase on the stone floor. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut was Margot's face, and for just a fraction of a second, the woman's mask of concern slipped. Her lips curved into the smallest, coldest smile of triumph. Then the corridor swallowed Nina in darkness, and she realized with terrible clarity that she'd just been framed by the very person who had tortured that child for 3 years. And now no one would ever believe the truth. The dungeon beneath Ironstone Palace was older than the castle itself, carved into living rock during the age when wolves ruled openly and humans cowered in their villages. The air was thick with centuries of suffering, damp stone, rusted iron, and the sour reek of fear that had soaked into the very walls. Nina hit the floor of her cell hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. The iron door clanged shut behind her, and she heard the heavy bolt slide home with a finality that made her stomach clench. She was alone in the darkness, with only a sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling high above. For a long moment she simply lay there, her body aching, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. She tried to help. She'd saved that child. And now she was going to die for it. Despair crashed over her in waves. She thought of her grandmother, dying alone now with no one to care for her. She thought of Michael, waking up pain-free for the first time in years, only to be told his rescuer was an assassin. She thought of Margot's cold smile, and fury joined the despair, hot and sharp. Then she felt it. A pull deep in her chest, like an invisible thread connecting her to something. Someone far above. Michael. She could sense him somehow, his presence like a warm light in the darkness. His heartbeat echoed in her ears, steady and strong and peaceful. Alive. Safe. For now. The pull intensified, becoming almost painful in its urgency. Protect him. Save him. You're running out of time. Outside her cell she heard voices. Guards discussing the construction of the execution platform, debating whether the Omega would cry or beg. Dawn was less than an hour away. Nina pressed her hands against the cold stone floor and pushed herself to her knees. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken when Nina was just a child, words she'd never fully understood. "Our bloodline is different, Nina. We're sageborn. When an alpha's life is threatened, something in us awakens. It's our purpose, our gift. Never forget what you are." Nina had always thought it was just a story, a comforting lie her mother told to make their Omega status seem less worthless. But now, in this moment of absolute need, she felt something stirring deep in her blood. Something ancient and powerful that had been sleeping all her life. The pull toward Michael grew stronger, almost unbearable. He needed her. Not just now but always. Whoever had hurt him would do it again. And Nina was the only one who knew the truth. "No," she whispered into the darkness. "I won't die here. Not like this." She gripped the iron bars of her cell, intending only to pull herself up. But the moment her hands closed around the metal, heat flooded through her body. Her muscles sang with sudden, impossible strength. The bars groaned. Nina's eyes widened. She pulled harder, testing, and the metal began to bend. This wasn't possible. She was an Omega, the weakest designation, barely stronger than a human. But her hands were moving the iron as if it were soft clay. The memory of her mother's words crystallized into certainty. Sageborn. This was real. She braced her feet against the wall and pulled with everything she had. The bars shrieked in protest, the sound echoing through the empty dungeon. One of them snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Then another. Nina squeezed through the gap, her dress tearing, her skin scraping against the rough metal, but she didn't care. She was free. Above her, through the stones, she could still feel Michael's presence. And beyond him, like a shadow cast by poisoned light, she sensed something else. Something dark and calculating, moving through the palace toward the child's room. Margot. Nina's lips pulled back from her teeth in a snarl that would have done any alpha proud. She had no proof, no evidence, no one who would believe her. But she had something else now. He had power. And she had less than an hour to find the truth before the palace woke and her life was forfeit. The hunt had begun. Nina moved through the palace like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. Her newfound senses guided her. She could smell the different corridors now, distinguish between the lived-in areas and the forgotten spaces. The physician's archive would be in the old wing, where the air tasted of dust and neglect. She found it behind a door marked with the medical caduceus, tucked away in a corridor most servants never entered. The lock was old but sturdy. Nina wrapped her hand around it and squeezed, feeling that strange heat flood through her again. The metal groaned and snapped like a dry twig. Inside, the room was lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding leather-bound journals and wooden filing boxes. Decades of medical records, birth certificates, death reports. Nina's hands shook as she began pulling boxes down, scanning labels by the thin moonlight filtering through a grimy window. Her time was running out. Dawn was creeping closer with every passing minute. Then she found it. A box labeled Royal Family Confidential. Inside were files organized by date. She pulled the most recent folder and her breath caught. X-ray films. Multiple ones spanning 3 years. She held the first one up to the moonlight and even with her untrained eye she could see it clearly. There, at the base of the skull, was an unmistakable foreign object. Dark and angular, exactly where she'd felt it. The date on the film made her stomach turn. 3 days after Queen Alara's death. Nina shuffled through the other films with trembling hands. Every single one showed the same thing. Monthly X-rays for 3 years, and in every single image the device was visible. The physician had documented it, photographed it, and done absolutely nothing. She found his notes clipped to the back of the file. Unusual cranial abnormality noted. Possibly genetic malformation. Patient exhibits signs of distress. Recommend continued observation. There was no mention of extraction, no suggestion of investigating further. Just passive observation of a child's torture. Someone had paid him. Or threatened him. Or both. Nina clutched the X-rays to her chest, her proof finally in hand. But as she turned to leave, another file caught her eye. This one was labeled simply King Abel New Hill Personal. She shouldn't. She was already running out of time. But something made her open it anyway. Inside were prescription records spanning 3 years. All of them signed by Lady Margot Sinclair, who apparently had some medical authority Nina hadn't known about. For treatment of grief and insomnia, the notes read. Regular doses of something called valerian compound, administered every evening in His Majesty's wine. Nina had helped her grandmother for years. She knew herbs, knew medicines. Valerian was used for sleep, yes, but not in these quantities. Not for 3 years straight. This wasn't treatment. This was sedation. Chemical control. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Margot had been drugging Abel, dulling his instincts, clouding his judgment. That's why he couldn't sense his son's suffering. That's why he'd believed Margot so easily, why he'd condemned Nina without question. He wasn't in his right mind. He hadn't been for 3 years. Nina grabbed both files and turned toward the door, her mind racing. She had evidence now. X-rays that proved Michael's torture. Prescription records that proved Abel's drugging. Surely this would be enough to... A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Nina froze, every muscle tensing. Through the crack in the door she saw a shadow moving. Someone was coming. And based on the confident, measured footsteps and the scent of jasmine perfume that preceded them, Nina knew exactly who it was. Margot had found her. Nina pressed herself against the wall behind a massive bookshelf, the X-rays and medical files clutched against her chest. The footsteps in the corridor paused outside the archive door. She could hear Margot's breathing, measured and calm. The woman was in no hurry. Why would she be? She thought Nina was locked safely in the dungeon, awaiting execution. The doorknob began to turn. Nina's eyes darted to the window, too small, too high. There was another door at the back of the archive, barely visible in the shadows. She moved on instinct, slipping through it just as Margot entered the main room. The back passage was narrow and dark, clearly meant for servants. Nina ran. She emerged in a familiar corridor and realized where she was. Near the royal quarters. Abel's private study was 3 doors down. If she could just reach him, show him the evidence before Margot caught up. But first she needed the final piece. The physical proof of the poisoning. Margot's chambers were adjacent to the king's, a privilege given to his most trusted advisor. Nina's new senses screamed danger as she slipped inside, but she had no choice. The room was elegant, filled with expensive fabrics and polished wood. Too perfect. Too calculated. Nina moved quickly to the ornate desk, pulling open drawers. Correspondence, ledgers, nothing useful. Then she noticed the locked cabinet in the corner, half hidden behind a decorative screen. Another lock that crumbled under her grip. Inside were rows of dark glass bottles, unlabeled, filled with a murky liquid. Nina uncorked one and sniffed carefully. The scent was familiar. Her grandmother had warned her about compounds like this. Valerian, yes, but mixed with something else. Moonshade extract. Wolfsbane derivative. Not enough to kill an alpha, but enough to dull their senses, suppress their instincts, make them suggestible. Medicine for grief, Nina whispered bitterly. This was chemical subjugation, served nightly in a crystal goblet. She grabbed one of the bottles and turned to leave but froze. Through the wall she heard voices. Multiple sets of footsteps moving fast. Guards. Margot's voice, sharp with command. Search every room. The Omega has escaped. She's armed and dangerous. Kill on sight. Nina's heart hammered against her ribs. She had minutes at best. She clutched the bottle and the X-rays and slipped back into the corridor, moving toward Abel's study. The king would be awake soon if he wasn't already. She needed to reach him before the sedative from last night's wine wore off completely, while he was still groggy enough to not immediately call for guards. She reached his door and pressed her ear against the wood. Inside she heard movement, the clink of glass, the rustle of fabric. He was awake. And based on the slow, heavy footsteps, still affected by last night's dose. This was her chance. Her only chance. Nina took a breath, steeling herself. She was an escaped prisoner about to burst into the Alpha King's private chambers with wild accusations about his most trusted advisor. If this went wrong, she'd be dead before she could finish a sentence. She could hear the guards coming closer, their boots thundering through distant corridors. Margot's voice carried through the palace like poison. Find her. Now. Nina's hand closed around the door handle. Behind her, death. Ahead of her, a king who'd already condemned her once. And somewhere above, a child who needed someone to fight for him. She pushed the door open and stepped into Alpha Abel Newhill's study, her voice steady despite her terror. Your Majesty. Don't call the guards. I can prove everything. Abel stood by his desk, still in his sleeping clothes, a wine goblet halfway to his lips. His gray eyes widened as they locked onto hers. And in the heartbeat before he could speak, before he could shout for help, Nina saw the guards appear in the corridor behind her, saw Margot's figure emerging from the shadows, and knew that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether she lived or died. Nina moved before Abel could react. She lunged forward and struck the goblet from his hand. Wine splashed across the floor in a crimson arc, the crystal shattering against stone. Don't drink it. It's poison. Abel's hand shot to his hip, where his blade would normally rest, but he wore only sleeping clothes. His eyes narrowed, dangerous and confused. You dare. Look. Nina thrust the X-rays toward him, the films trembling in her hands. Your son. 3 years of torture. The physician documented everything and did nothing. Someone paid him to ignore it. Abel's eyes flickered to the images, and she saw something crack in his expression. Recognition. Her. But before he could speak, Margot's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Your Majesty, step away from her. Margot swept into the room with 4 guards at her back, her face a perfect mask of concern and fear. She's escaped from the dungeon. She's clearly deranged. Don't listen to her lies. These aren't lies. Nina held up the dark bottle. This is what you've been giving him. Every night for 3 years. It's not medicine. It's a sedative mixed with wolfsbane derivative. She's been drugging you, keeping you compliant while She's insane, Margot interrupted smoothly, turning to the guards. Seize her. Now. The guards moved forward, but Abel raised his hand. Wait. His voice was hoarse, his eyes still fixed on the X-rays. I want to hear this. My lord, you're not thinking clearly, Margot said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. She's confused you, manipulated you. This is exactly what assassins do. Father. Every head turned. Michael stood in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted by the morning light. His golden eyes were clear, bright, alive in a way they hadn't been for 3 years. He walked into the room with steady steps, no trembling, no pain-induced stagger. Michael. Abel's voice broke on his son's name. She killed Mother, Michael said, his voice clear and strong, pointing directly at Margot. I saw her put something in her tea. And then she put the thing in my head. His hand went to the base of his skull, where a fresh bandage covered Nina's extraction site. She said if I ever told anyone she'd kill you too, father. She said she'd make it look like an accident. The room went deathly silent. Margot's mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her face twisted into something cold and vicious. You little... She didn't finish the sentence. Her body convulsed, bones cracking and reforming. In seconds, a massive black wolf stood where the woman had been, lips pulled back from fangs dripping with saliva. She launched herself at Michael. Nina moved on pure instinct, intercepting Margot mid-leap. They crashed into the wall and Nina felt her sage-born strength surge. She grabbed the wolf's jaws and held them apart, even as claws raked across her shoulders. Blood poured down her arms, but she didn't let go. Abel, she screamed. Look at me. The king stood frozen, his mind still sluggish from years of drugging, trying to process too much information at once. Nina knew she had seconds before Margot's superior strength overwhelmed her. She did the only thing she could think of. She released one hand from Margot's jaws, letting the wolf's teeth sink into her shoulder, and lunged for Abel. Her fingers found his face, and the moment skin touched skin, she felt the psychic bond snap into place. The sage-born gift her mother had spoken of, the ability to protect alphas by showing them truth. Images flooded through the connection. Margot slipping poison into Queen Alara's evening tea. Margot holding a screaming 4-year-old Michael down while she drove the silver barb into his skull. Margot whispering in Abel's ear every night, shaping his decisions, isolating him from advisors who questioned her, weaving a web of control that had strangled this pack for 3 years. Abel's eyes went wide, then blazed with fury. The drug-induced fog burned away like morning mist under a sun made of pure rage. He shifted, his transformation explosive and violent. One moment a man, the next a massive grey wolf that dwarfed even Margot's impressive size. He tore Margot away from Nina with a roar that shook the windows. The black wolf barely had time to turn before Abel's jaws closed around her throat. There was no trial, no ceremony, no formal accusation. Just justice, swift and absolute. When Abel released her, Margot's body hit the floor and shifted back to human form, eyes vacant, throat torn open. Dead. Nina collapsed against the wall, bleeding from a dozen wounds, her shoulder screaming where Margot's teeth had found purchase. But through the pain she felt Michael's small hand slip into hers, and heard his whispered words, "Thank you." Abel shifted back to human form, breathing hard, his eyes finally clear. He looked at Nina, then at his son, then at the body of the woman he'd trusted for 3 years. When he spoke, his voice was raw with grief and rage and terrible understanding. "Tell me everything." The royal physician tended to Nina's wounds in silence, his hands shaking as he wrapped bandages around her torn shoulder. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He knew she'd seen his records, knew his complicity in Michael's suffering. Abel dismissed him with a single look that promised future reckoning. Now they sat in Abel's private chambers, the king, the Omega Maid, and the child who'd survived 3 years of torture. Michael had refused to leave Nina's side, his small hand gripping hers with surprising strength. The boy who'd been feral and violent for years now sat quietly, his golden eyes tracking every movement his father made. "I need to understand," Abel said finally, his voice rough. He looked older than he had that morning, the weight of 3 years of manipulation settling onto his shoulders. "How did I not see it? How did I not know?" Nina met his gaze. "She drugged you. For 3 years. You couldn't trust your own instincts because they weren't yours anymore." Abel's jaw clenched. He moved to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and stained. This was Ilara's. I haven't been able to open it since she died. But if there are answers. He held it out to Nina. Please. Read it to me. I don't think I can bear to see her handwriting. Nina took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft, well-loved. She opened it to the first page and began to read. The early entries were mundane. Daily observations, pack politics, plans for the nursery. But as Nina turned pages, the tone shifted. Ilara wrote of her inability to conceive, of the hereditary condition that made pregnancy impossible, of her fear that Abel would set her aside, that the pack would fall without an heir. Then came the entry that made Nina's heart stop. I found her, Nina read aloud. Sarah. A sage-born Omega with the gift of protection and the scent of lavender and rain. She's agreed to be our surrogate, to carry our child and then disappear to protect the secret. She asks nothing in return except care for her own daughter when the time comes. The journal slipped from Nina's fingers. Lavender. Her mother had always smelled of lavender. It had been her signature, the thing people remembered about Sarah Henderson even after she died. Keep reading, Abel said quietly, something new in his voice. Suspicion or hope, Nina couldn't tell. With shaking hands, Nina retrieved the journal and continued. Ilara detailed the pregnancy, the birth of a healthy son and Sarah's quiet departure. But the later entries grew darker. I'm being poisoned, Ilara wrote 6 months before her death. I see it now. Margot. She's not who she claims. I've found evidence linking her to the Shadowfen pack. She's been positioning herself to destroy us from within. I must tell Abel, but I'm growing weaker. The baby, my Michael, she's threatened him. I see the way she looks at him. The final entry was dated the day Ilara died, written in a shaking hand. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Margot has won this battle. But I've planted seeds for the future. Sarah's daughter, Nina, will come to the palace when she's of age. I've arranged it. She is Abel's true fated mate. The sage-born bloodline recognizing the Alpha King. She will protect our son. She will save our pack. Trust her, my love. Trust the Omega with lavender in her soul. Silence filled the chamber. Nina couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mother had carried Michael. Which meant, you're his aunt, Abel said, working through the implications. Your mother was his biological mother. And Nina couldn't finish the sentence. Fated mate. Chosen by a dying queen. Destiny arranged by a woman who'd seen further than her own death. Michael tugged on her hand. Does this mean you'll stay? He asked, his voice small and hopeful. You won't leave like everyone else? Nina looked at the boy, her nephew, then at Abel, whose gray eyes held 1,000 questions and the beginning of something that might have been recognition. The sage-born bond that had awakened in the dungeon suddenly made terrible, beautiful sense. It wasn't just about protecting an Alpha's child. It was about protecting her family. I'll stay, Nina whispered and felt the truth of it settle into her bones like an oath. But even as she spoke, she saw the shadow cross Abel's face, the doubt that 3 years of manipulation had carved deep. Ilara had chosen her, but Abel didn't know her, didn't trust her, didn't love her. And Nina realized that the hardest battle might not have been defeating Margot. It might be convincing this broken king that destiny could be trusted at all. 3 months had passed since the morning Margot's blood stained the king's study floor, but Nina still sometimes woke expecting to find herself back in that dungeon cell, awaiting execution for crimes she didn't commit. Then she'd feel Michael's small hand in hers. He'd taken to sleeping in her chambers when nightmares plagued him, and remember that this was real. He was Luna now. Guardian. Family. The transformation in Michael was nothing short of miraculous. The feral, pain-racked child had blossomed into a bright, curious boy who asked endless questions and laughed freely. His alpha abilities were developing properly now, his wolf form healthy and strong. During training sessions with his father, he demonstrated the kind of natural talent that had been buried under 3 years of torture. Aunt Nina, watch this, he called from the training yard, and Nina's heart swelled every time he used that title. He shifted smoothly, his young wolf form tackling a practice dummy with impressive precision. Abel stood beside her, and she felt his presence like a constant warmth. The king had emerged from his drugged fog slowly, painfully, learning to trust his own instincts again. Learning to trust her. It hadn't been easy. 3 years of manipulation had left scars deeper than any blade could cut. But day by day he'd opened himself to the possibility that Alara's final gift might have been exactly what their broken pack needed. The assassination attempt had come 6 weeks into Nina's tenure as Luna-in-waiting. A Shadowfen infiltrator, desperate to complete Margot's mission. Nina had sensed the poisoned blade before it left its sheath, her sageborn instincts screaming warning. She'd moved faster than any Omega should, disarming the attacker with strength that left the entire pack council speechless. After that, no one questioned her position. The sageborn bloodline was real, and it had chosen to protect the Ironstone pack. Now, as the sun set over the palace, Nina stood in her chambers preparing for the bonding ceremony. Her grandmother sat in a cushioned chair, tears streaming down her weathered face. The old woman had arrived at the palace a month ago, her illness treated by the royal physicians, her final years secured in comfort. "Your mother would be so proud," her grandmother whispered. "Sarah always knew you were destined for something greater." The ceremony was simple but profound. The entire pack gathered in the great hall, hundreds of wolves both in human and animal form. Nina wore a gown of silver and blue, the colors of the Ironstone pack. Michael stood beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly, refusing to let go even when the ceremony master suggested he step back. Abel approached, wearing the formal regalia of the Alpha King, but his eyes were soft when they met hers. "Alara chose you," he said quietly so only she could hear. "But I choose you too, Nina. Not because of destiny or duty, but because you're the strongest person I've ever known." He placed his hand over hers and Michael's, completing the trinity. "Alpha, Luna and Heir. I, Abel Newhill, Alpha King of the Ironstone Pack, claim Nina Henderson as my mate, my Luna and my equal. Let any who would challenge this bond speak now or be forever bound by this oath." Silence. Then from the assembled pack, a howl of acceptance that shook the ancient stones of the palace. Nina felt the bond snap into place, not just with Abel but with every wolf present. The sageborn connection amplified, spreading through the pack like roots through soil. They were hers to protect now. All of them. That night, after the celebration had quieted, Nina sat on Michael's bed while Abel stood in the doorway, watching. The boy was drowsy, safe, loved. Nina pulled out a small, worn book, her mother's journal, different from Alara's but no less precious. "Read me the story," Michael mumbled, his eyes already closing. Nina opened to the page she knew by heart and began. "Our bloodline protects Alpha's little one. It is our purpose, our gift, and our greatest honor. We are sageborn and we do not break. We do not falter. We stand between those we love and the darkness, and we hold the line." Michael's breathing evened into sleep. Nina closed the book and looked up to find Abel's eyes on her, full of something that looked like wonder. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, his hand finding hers. "I didn't believe in destiny," he said softly. "But you've made me believe in second chances." Nina smiled, squeezing his hand. Outside, the Ironstone Pack slept peacefully, protected by truth, united by sacrifice and guarded by a bloodline older than the stones themselves. The nightmare was over. The healing had only just begun. But for the first time in 3 years the palace didn't feel like a prison. It felt like home. And there you have it. Nina's journey from desperate Omega to powerful Luna, the secret that nearly destroyed a kingdom and the sageborn bloodline that saved it all. But here's the thing, pack members. This is just the beginning. The Ironstone Pack is safe for now, but there are more stories waiting in the shadows. More secrets buried in ancient bloodlines. More wolves with destinies they never saw coming. My next video drops soon and trust me, you won't want to miss it. We're diving into another tale where nothing is as it seems, and the price of truth might be higher than anyone's willing to pay. The moon has many stories to tell and I'm just getting started. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because when the next story drops, you'll want to be first in the pack to hear it. This is your Luna signing off, but I'll see you in the next hunt. Until then, remember, we are sageborn. We do not break. We do not falter. We stand between those we love and the darkness, and we hold the line.